Shana Tova. So I'm about to get into trouble. I typically avoid politics from the bima. First, because it's completely unfair for me to engage in it when there's no chance for a response. It's not a conversation, it's a lecture. Second, because the people who agree with me don't need convincing, and those who disagree with me will just get angry. Third, because I really treasure the First Amendment to the Constitution. We have the freedom to practice our faith undisturbed by the government, and in return, our political advocacy must be very carefully chosen and focused on the issues that transcend political party. I will not be weighing in on the presidential election or even any of the down-ballot races. I assume that most of you have your minds made up by now. And if trends hold true, the single biggest factor in each one of our votes will be the home that we grew up in and the parties that we prefer, therefore. And in Massachusetts, let's face it, we're not really in play, so I won't spend time sowing divisions that will yield no fruit. Instead, this morning, I will be speaking about an issue that I believe transcends political party and ideology and should concern every one of us. This is an issue that reaches from the far right of libertarian ideology to the crunchy granola tree huggers of the left, and there is hardly a family that is not affected by it. Since its declaration in 1971 by President Nixon, our war on drugs has been an unremitting effort to interdict, arrest, and imprison our way out of drug use and abuse. Just last year, Customs and Border Control, listen to this, seized 136,000 pounds of cocaine, 2,000 pounds of heroin, more than 6,000 pounds of methamphetamine, and 4.3 million pounds of marijuana. Naturally, with such a concerted effort, there were no drugs left to be sold on the streets of America in 2015, and addiction was conquered. From your laughter, you get my point. What I should be saying is, it made absolutely no difference. This fiscal year, the Office for National Drug Control Policy is spending $28 billion. This is just the federal budget. The request for next year, $31 billion. This doesn't touch state and local budgets. It doesn't touch the cost of our police departments, our courts, our jails. Since that year of 1971, there have been 1 million arrests a year in the United States for drugs. 1 million. We have made ourselves, as a result, into the most imprisoned country in the world. Not by percentage, not by per capita, but by actual numbers. With 4 times the population and a repressive government, China has fewer people in jail than we do. We're number 1. For all our efforts, for all our treasure spent, it has had no influence on our drug problem or usage, and we may in fact be making things worse. Let me explain. You know, we've been down this road before. More than a century ago, the rising moral outrage over alcohol consumption changed our country forever. The temperance movement succeeded in passing constitutional amendment enforcing alcohol prohibition. In 1919, alcohol became illegal to possess, manufacture, or distribute anywhere in the United States. For the next 13 years, until that amendment was repealed, we had a natural experiment, what economists like to look at. See what actually happens if you do it, and what happens when prohibition comes into effect. Looking back, the results should have been utterly predictable. Drinking patterns changed. Instead of public or social drinking, we had binge drinking in speakeasies. The rage became home brewing and home distilling, bathtub gin. People were willing to run the risk of poisoning themselves. America's favorite drink went from before Prohibition, beer, to after Prohibition, whiskey. Instead of a safe and legal supply, criminal gangs took over sales and distribution. Smuggling across our long Canadian border and off the coasts was rampant. The profits were so high that the drug gangs in charge of alcohol at that point had reason to kill anyone who threatened their income. Gangsters became folk heroes. Worst of all, everyday common citizens were made into criminals. A glass of wine with dinner became a federal offense in 1919. It inculcated a lack of respect for the law and the Constitution when it was so obviously misguided, if not downright stupid. If you can imagine such a thing, congressmen would pass resolutions for stricter enforcement of prohibition before going out for cocktails themselves. Seems almost unthinkable in the United States Congress. Pauline Sabine, who founded the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform during that time, testified thusly before Congress. In pre-prohibition days, mothers had little fear in regard to the saloon as far as their children were concerned. A saloon keeper's license was revoked if he were caught selling liquor to minors. Today, in any speakeasy in the United States, you can find boys and girls in their teens drinking liquor. And this situation has become so acute that the mothers of the country feel something must be done to protect their children. At the distance of almost a century now, we can look back at the period of Prohibition as one of the stupidest things we ever did as a country. We created organized crime. We took what was a public health problem and turned it into a criminal one. We took ordinary, law-abiding Americans and turned them into criminals. And so I have to ask, why did we turn around and then do it again? There's a ballot initiative that we will all have a voice on this November, and its presence is what's compelling me to speak out today. Massachusetts Proposition 4 is a call to end marijuana prohibition and treat it the same way we do alcohol. I can argue in favor of it using logic. Nearly everything I said about our experiment with prohibition in the 1920s is just as true with marijuana prohibition. We have made ordinary Americans into criminals. As we went from beer to whiskey, so has the strength of marijuana increased almost as a direct result of prohibition. Drug prohibition created brutal criminal gangs to control distribution and sales, determined to keep their profits. Once again, cross-border smuggling is rampant. This should all sound very familiar. The only difference between the two actions is the length of the prohibition and the corrupting effects on our society associated with it. Now, logic may be compelling, but that's not enough reason for this rabbi to speak out. What can Jewish tradition tell us? Now, you may be surprised that there's not much in the Talmud about marijuana. But to understand how rabbinic law works, we have to find categorization. The rabbis would look at a new phenomenon and say, well, what is this thing most like, so that we can deal with it the same way? And once we know what category something fits into, we can then draw reasonable conclusions. In our case, marijuana can most be likened to tobacco and alcohol, two subjects that the rabbis do deal with. As with alcohol and tobacco, they are unnecessary for human life, they are used for pleasurable intoxication, and they both have the potential for great harm. So now we know the category, so we can talk about it. So how is tobacco treated in Jewish law? Well, for a long time, it was just fine. When tobacco became introduced in the 16th century to Europe, there were no known harms associated with it. Many rabbis smoked, and because of that, it was often seen as having the imprimatur of the Gidolei Ador, the greats of the generation. Well, if that rabbi smoked, it must be okay for me. And there's a general principle of Jewish law derived from the Talmud. She'en gozrin gezerah al hatzibor, Ele imken rov tzibor yicholin la'amod ba. That we don't create a new edict, a new restriction, unless most of the community can live with it, can abide by it. In other words, if so many people smoke tobacco, you can't issue an edict that would be ignored and turn them all into sinners and scofflaws. Pretty reasonable legal principle. We also have the principle in Torah law that one may not deliberately cause oneself injury. The Torah, the Mishnah, the Talmud, all of the later legal codes concur. It's summed up by Maimonides quite beautifully in the Mishnah Torah. This is what he says. Seeing that keeping the body healthy and whole is the way of God, for it is impossible to understand or know anything about our Creator if one is weighed down by illness. Therefore, a person must distance himself from things which destroy the body and accustom himself to things which heal the body. In light of this, the weight of rabbinic law over the last decades has shifted strongly against tobacco, since there is no longer any doubt about its harmful nature. A study published in The Lancet in 2013 found that 67% of the subjects who smoked tobacco died of smoking-related disease. 2 out of 3. Halakha, rabbinic law, has responded, and tobacco consumption has been ruled self-destructive and sinful. Conservative, Reform, and Orthodox authorities all concur. Tobacco is forbidden to Jews. In fact, a 2006 Zogby poll commissioned by the Drug Policy Alliance found that 45% of Americans were in favor of full tobacco prohibition, including a majority of those 18 to 29. So, Jewish authorities tell us using tobacco is sinful and self-destructive. And we know it is brutally expensive for our healthcare system. And yet, we also know it would be an awful idea to outlaw it. We can and do influence behavior by exerting social pressure. We educate, we apply sin taxes. And let's face it, it's working. Smoking numbers continue to go down. Every year, fewer people take up tobacco. So what about alcohol in Jewish life? At root, the rabbis understand alcohol to be a source of pleasure. This is how the Talmud speaks of it. Our rabbis taught, a person is required to bring joy to his children and his household on a holiday, for it says in the Torah, V'samachta b'chagecha. You should rejoice on your holiday. With what does he bring them joy? Wine. We learned when the temple was standing, there would be no rejoicing except with meat, which means, of course, the meats of the sacrifices that were brought. Your pleasure was in the barbecue. Really? As it says in the Torah, you shall also sacrifice peace offerings and eat there, rejoicing before God. But now that the temple is no longer standing in Jerusalem, there is no rejoicing except with wine, as it says in Psalms, Yain yismach levav enosh. Wine makes glad the heart of man. So the case is closed. Alcohol is fine. Not exactly. Although wine makes us happy, we all know there is too much of a good thing. Drunkenness is strictly prohibited. The priests, the Kohanim, are warned in the Torah against taking alcohol before the divine service. Both of Aaron's sons were struck down for proceeding drunkenly with priestly ritual. Our master Maimonides speaks out this way on alcohol consumption. When a wise man drinks wine, he only drinks in order to moisturize the food in his intestines. That is, along with your meal. And anyone who gets drunk, behold, he is a sinner and has degraded his wisdom. If he gets drunk before ignoramuses, he has profaned the name of God. Chilul Hashem. That is a grave sin. So Maimonides held, as I suspect some of us do, that our rational minds are our most divine aspect, that thing that draws us closest to God. If we lessen our ability to think and behave accordingly by drinking, it is an attack, as it were, against God. Most Jewish authorities have some version of Maimonides' respect for moderation. Alcohol is permitted and even approved of in context. Too much of it is seen as sinful. So if you finish your day today with a martini and a cigarette, congratulations, you're 2 for 2. I'll see you here on Yom Kippur, 10 days. But something else can be drawn from this. The rabbis draw a practical line between use and abuse. Social context, purpose, and results matter. So let's not kid ourselves about the social cost of alcohol. Let me tell you a story about a wedding I did in May. I flew out to Nantucket to do a wedding for a couple, and I went over to pick up my cab to get back to the airport. The driver was waiting for me. When I'm alone in a cab, I usually sit in the front seat and talk to the driver. I'm always interested in what they have to say. We got talking for a while, and he was a really interesting man. He was a retired policeman who had worked 25 years on Nantucket. And I asked him, because he was a younger man, why it is that he had retired. Well, he told me he couldn't take the stress of the job anymore. And I thought about it for a minute. Nantucket? I said, yeah, it must be mostly DUIs and traffic problems. And he looked at me and he said, no. It was the domestic abuse that made him stop. He couldn't take it anymore. And this is what he said to me, too. 90% of the time he showed up for somebody for a domestic abuse call, drinking. He simply couldn't take it anymore. He's a good man. Really enjoyed my conversation with him. He stayed active in his community. He's a pillar of his church on Nantucket, who couldn't stand being a cop anymore because of the effects of alcohol. Take a walk around Hyannis. See what you see. Do you see the effects of alcohol? I can take a walk around my house in Centerville and find empty nips, those little one-shotters that the people buy at the liquor store for 99 cents, all over the sides of the road. People are drinking them and throwing them out of their cars. The National Institute of Health reports 88,000 deaths annually in the United States attributable to alcohol. 88,000. In 2014, about a third of all traffic deaths were alcohol-related. That's 10,000 people. The bill? Alcohol misuse costs our country about $250 billion a year, and it is implicated in at least 37% of violent crimes. What's the problem? We're just going out for a few drinks, right? That's the problem. So where does marijuana fall? Somewhere between these two, alcohol and tobacco. There is no biblical verse about marijuana. There's no Talmudic passage that mentions it directly. So instead, we have to reason our way forward from the sources. Does it cause harm to the extent of alcohol or tobacco? Well, while more research is always good, there's not a lot of evidence that speaks to its physical dangers. Overdose is not deadly. Frankly, we have a problem because not enough is known about its long-term effects, in large part because the study of it is forbidden. A recent study published by the Journal of the American Medical Association showed the only notable effect after 20 years of chronic marijuana smoking, this is from ages 18 to 38, was increased periodontal disease. No other increased mortality. On the other hand, some of these people also had lower body mass indexes, smaller waists, and better high-density lipoprotein, HDL, the good cholesterol. These results have led researchers to think that cannabis may have an impact on metabolism. So much for the body. What about the brain? Again, it's difficult to do proper studies in the US because marijuana is a Schedule I drug. It's totally forbidden. but some meta-analysis has shown that long-term chronic use of marijuana leads to a shrinking of the region of the brain known as the hippocampus. We shouldn't be surprised. Long-term chronic drug use really isn't good for you. Occasional and moderate use is unlikely to have the same effect. Especially in the light of Jewish traditions regarding other intoxicants, I must conclude there is little support for recreational marijuana. But should it be illegal? That's really the question. In 2016, according to the latest Gallup polls, the number of people who smoke marijuana in the U.S. isn't much less than those who use tobacco. Yes. Ein gozrin gezerah al hatzibor, ele im ken rov tzibor yecholin la'amod ba. We don't issue an edict restricting behavior unless most people can abide by it. Sinful doesn't mean illegal. By that same First Amendment, we should be aware that in trying to impose personal morality through the force of law is usually a losing proposition. And the rabbis did understand the difference between use and abuse. The gateway drug theories have been largely discredited. What we do know is that people who suffer from addiction use lots of substances. They use everything that they can get their hands on. The gateway drug theory mistakes correlation with causation. We have another great natural experiment to help us with this. Colorado has legalized marijuana. And as a result, there's been no increase in teen use. None. They've held steady at the national average since 2011. Teen use rates are actually down slightly since 2009. What they have found, where medical marijuana has been legalized, prescription opiate use has actually decreased. There's a study out of the University of Georgia examining all the prescriptions filled through Medicare Part D. They found that in states with medical marijuana legalized, the average doctor, this is each doctor, on average, prescribed 1,800 fewer pain pills each year. Now, medical marijuana may not be ideal, and it may not be adequately studied. That's our own fault. But I would dare say it's better than opiates. Perhaps that's why the major producers of the pain pills are protecting their turf now through lobbying efforts and funding opposition to medical marijuana at every turn. In this regard, they are no different than any other major drug gang. So this is why I feel compelled to speak out. The results of our policy are first and foremost an issue of racial justice, because our drug war is intimately tied up in race. From the earliest days of reefer madness, societal reaction has always been about race. Marijuana was associated with Mexican immigrants in the early 20th century, and then with African American jazz musicians. A never-ending parade of ridiculous yellow journalism through the Hearst newspapers, sensationalist reporting made the case. So where has it taken us? Well, from 2001 to 2010, throughout that decade, 7 million Americans were arrested for simple possession of marijuana. And despite slightly higher rates of use by whites than blacks, African Americans are almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for simple possession. How are we not outraged at such blatant bias and inequality before the law? Where is our sense of racial justice? Stop and frisk policies have been in the news lately. It's worth taking another look at them. The last year they were in full effect in 2012, New Yorkers were stopped by the police about 500,000 times. Actually a little more, 533,000 times. 89% of the people they stopped were totally innocent of anything. 55% of the people they stopped were black, 32% of the people were Latino, only 10% were white. So 500,000 stops. What was the result? They found 729 guns. To clarify, our public safety officials, our police, were deployed at great public expense to stop and frisk people who 99.85% of the time did not have a weapon and posed no threat. What did they find? 5,000 arrests for simple marijuana possession. Because in New York, public possession is a crime. And so in the process of having them empty their pockets at the stop and frisk, it came into public view and the cuffs were slapped on. It effectively became an expensive and ineffective use of police power for people who were walking while brown. And the arrests, they have real effects. Many states have felony disenfranchisements. That first arrest means you'll never be able to vote again. And guess which groups suffer most as a result? Where is our outrage? These same people are at a disadvantage in job applications, school loans if they choose to better themselves, government benefits for job retraining. Families lose their wage earners. Our policy has basically been an engine to create more poverty across the country. We have a failed policy turning ordinary Americans into criminals. Listen, I cannot and I will not endorse drug use from the pulpit of the Cape Cod Synagogue. But I know if I asked for a show of hands what the statistics would reveal here. About 40% of you. I also find myself as something of a hypocrite, as I consume a drug in front of everyone here with regularity right from the bima. For the last 80 years, and in earnest in the last 45, we have pursued marijuana with every legal means available, and the policy has been an abject and total failure at every level. We are helping to create the very thing we wish to avoid. We took a public health problem and turned it into a law enforcement issue. We failed to distinguish between use and abuse as we do with alcohol. For all of our trillions spent and our millions imprisoned, we have had absolutely no effect on attitudes and use. In fact, more people than ever in the United States, 58% of them at the last poll, believe in full legalization. It's time to try something different. I know I don't stand alone. The Central Conference of American Rabbis said this in a resolution approved in 1973. The CCAR does not presume to make a judgment on medical aspects of the use of marijuana. However, we are deeply concerned by the fear reaction of legislators and law enforcement officials who have imposed severe criminal penalties for what is essentially a matter of private behavior and individual conscience. The National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, in its official report to President Nixon and the Congress of the United States entitled "Marijuana, a Signal of Misunderstanding," has urged federal and state decriminalization of possession, use, and distribution of marijuana to the extent that possession in private of marijuana for personal use would no longer be an offense, and distribution in private of small amounts of marijuana for no remuneration or insignificant remuneration not involving a profit would no longer be an offense. The CCAR urges that the federal and state governments adopt these recommendations from the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse. That was in 1973. It was as clear then as it is now. Look, Mass Proposition 4 is not a perfect law. I've yet to see one of those. But I do believe it is a vast improvement from where we are now. I hope that you will join me in getting this initiative passed and get ourselves refocused and acting in ways which can actually help with addiction. Not chase the fantasy that more police and more enforcement will somehow give us a different result than we've had for the last 100 years. How long can we repeat the same behavior and expect different results? We're Massachusetts. We're the cradle of the revolution. Our actions in 2005 triggered a nationwide response on same-sex marriage, and I thank God for that, because it brought us into the current. Long-held beliefs were challenged, and we realized, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. It's in our hands to do the same thing on this misguided, ineffective, and profligate marijuana policy. We can signal the rest of the nation that it's time to try a different way, to treat public health problems for what they are, and not pretend we can fix them with policing. I intend to submit a resolution to the CCAR for consideration in March to reaffirm our commitment to the stand in 1973 to changing a misguided and ultimately racist application of our laws. I hope that you join me. Shana Tova.